The summer light on Long Island could feel like a trick, a quiet gloss laid over a world that was already breaking. The wind rolled in from Peconic Bay, pushing soft ripples against the pilings of a weathered dock, carrying the faint brine of the water and the grass-sweet smell of the shore. In a shingled cottage tucked behind a thicket of bayberry and scrub pine, Albert Einstein tried to read a few pages of a book and could not keep the lines from slipping. He set the book down, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and listened to the small domestic sounds, the kettle muttering on the stove, the screen door clicking when a gust caught it, the pencil scratch of his companion at the kitchen table. Even here, in the supposed refuge of summer, the world was inside the room with them. He thought about the letters already on his desk and the letter that had not yet been written. He thought about Berlin and the years when laughter in a seminar room could outshine the long winter mornings, about colleagues who had vanished into Europe's new shadows, about calculations that used to feel like a sanctuary and now felt like warnings. He had spent much of his life believing that any power born of understanding would improve the human condition. It was a beautiful belief. Beauty does not make things less true when the dusk comes. In New York City, across bridges and heat-shimmered streets, Leó Szilárd walked quickly without seeming to run, turning over phrases in his head as if a good sentence might change the world by itself. He had never been enamored of good sentences. He preferred workable mechanisms. But words were the only instruments available today, and the physics, God help them, the physics was already too clear. In a small room not far from Columbia University, with a fan batting warm air from one corner to another, he spread fresh paper and flattened it with the heel of his hand. He had once stood at a London crosswalk and imagined a chain reaction in his mind, neutrons breeding neutrons the way ideas breed ideas, and the image had not left him in 6 years. Now it had matter to cling to, uranium, neutrons slowed by graphite or water, the calculation that the multiplication factor could exceed 1. 6 years for an idea to find its fuel. He took a breath and began to write. The discovery was already a story with too many authors and a chorus of ghosts. In Berlin, Hahn and Strissman had found the signature of barium where none had any right to be. In Sweden, Lise Meitner, exiled by a border and a category, had stood in the snow with her nephew Otto Frisch, drawing lines in the air to show how a nucleus might cleave like a drop, releasing the stored curve of binding energy as if a taut string had finally snapped. The paper had been quick, clean, careful. It had sounded like a door opening with a gentle click. The noise on the other side was louder. At Columbia, Szilárd pressed graphite together and dreamed of lattices. He spoke to Fermi, whose calm could make almost anything seem ordinary, to Wigner, who tilted at details until they fell into place, to Teller, whose eyebrows arched like parentheses around improbable futures. They wrote memos with the urgency of men who feared that the other side would read the same journals, think the same thoughts, and have fewer reasons to wait. They knew where the best ore lay buried, in the Belgian Congo, not in Europe's torn fields, and who might control it if the wrong government remembered to ask. They knew that France had strong minds, but a weakening position, that Britain had air and courage and too little time, that America had distance, resources, and a habit of moving late. Szilárd's hands were not steady. He put the pen down and stared at the window, where the city seemed to sweat. He pictured a generator that did not end with a light bulb, but a flash that erased streets. He pictured a letter that landed on the right desk and turned a country's attention by a few degrees, enough to intercept a future before it arrived. The images were not precise. He was not drawing reactor schematics now, but they were practical in a way that poise and noble phrases were not. He folded one sheet of notes, then another, and gathered the courage to make a telephone call. On Long Island, the breeze changed. Einstein poured tea and waited. He had known Szilárd long enough to recognize the cadence of him, that mix of patient insistence and impatient morality, the way he would lay out a problem as if it had already happened and the conversation was about what to do when time reversed itself. When Szilárd arrived by car, dust trailing behind the fenders, Einstein met him at the door with a look that said he would listen, and with luck, that would be enough. They sat at the table. Szilárd spoke of fission, of the multiplication factor, of the effect of moderators and the point at which a pile of matter stops being simply matter and becomes a device. He spoke of ore shipments and Belgian trustees, of laboratories in Paris, and the possibility that German physicists, as brilliant as any in the world and as bounded by circumstance as anyone, might be compelled to do the same arithmetic under orders. He did not dramatize. He did not need to. It is not dramatic to say that a chain reaction is a chain reaction. Einstein listened the way a mountain listens to weather, slow and thorough, sifting the gusts from the storms. He followed each step where it went. The contradictions within him did not argue, because they were not contradictions in that moment. He had spent his life in the service of understanding. He had stood for pacifism with a stubbornness that annoyed and inspired in equal measure. He had no illusions about the nature of the regime that had driven him from the university rooms he loved. A scientist does not accept a premise because it is convenient. He accepts it because it sits in the mind and refuses to be moved by force. When Szilárd finished, Einstein looked at the window and said that the world had never been ready for its discoveries. Then he asked how the letter should begin. The phrasing mattered. It had to be plain, as if it were any ordinary matter of supply and planning, and it had to carry sufficient weight to shake a president's calendar loose from other obligations. It had to make the case that delaying would be a choice, not an accident, and that this choice would not be forgiven by history if it left the initiative to a government already expert in not asking permission. They tried a sentence and crossed it out. They tried another and let it stand for a minute like a scaffold before deciding it would not hold. The words were a device to transfer urgency without panic, to convey that a nation's physics department had quietly become part of its defense ministry whether anyone wanted it to or not. Einstein's handwriting curved in careful arcs. He suggested they not dwell on miracles. Presidents are not moved by miracles, only by costs and risks and what can be done by autumn. He suggested they mention ore, because ore is tangible, can be counted and shipped and embargoed, and the possibility of a chain reaction that would power submarines or, if pushed, do something worse on land. He did not sketch how to do the worst thing. One does not need to sketch gravity to understand a fall. In a city office, Alexander Sachs read an early draft later and frowned at its shape. He was a bridge in a time when bridges were rare, a man who knew the rhythms of Washington and could fit new stories into old rooms. He had a banker's trust in the persuasive power of prudence and a storyteller's sense of when to pause. He told Szilárd that a letter must travel with a voice, and that the best way to place this paper before the president was to carry it in himself when the hour ripened. Letters alone die on secretaries' desks. The most dangerous ideas are always accompanied, never mailed. The world, meanwhile, moved in the old way, with the slow inevitability of armies. In September, the tanks crossed into Poland and the word war lost its speculative quality. Britain and France declared what they could not yet enforce. The ocean became both distance and delay. In Princeton and New York, in Chicago and Berkeley, laboratories picked up speed. In Berlin and Leipzig and Göttingen, rooms emptied and doors locked, and those who remained stood at the boards with an odd combination of horror and discipline. A reaction proceeds if there is fuel and a path. People are not entirely different. Einstein returned to his cottage and then to Princeton, where the leaves turned and he walked in a coat that became a uniform, hair ungovernable, pipe in hand, expression distant but not absent. He disliked the machinery of influence, but he had allowed his name to do a job it was suited for, a catalyst in a human reaction. He still believed, stubbornly, that reason could moderate the speed of events. He also believed that refraining from action did not absolve a person of responsibility, it simply assigned that responsibility to someone else. Szilárd slept poorly. He kept running the same back-of-the-envelope estimates through his mind until they blurred. He worried about the assumptions baked into every model, cross-sections pulled from imperfect experiments, the purity of the material, the density of the pile, the ways in which reality would refuse to obey the cleanness of a graphite lattice drawing. He did not romanticize what came next. Bureaucracy, procurement, misunderstandings, he expected all of it. He feared not the slog, but the void, a president who never heard the case before the news arrived from Europe and made it irrelevant. The appointment with Roosevelt came in October, which is ordinary for miracles and late for disasters. Alexander Sachs arrived at the White House with the letter folded neatly in a portfolio that looked too small for what it carried. Outside, the air had that early autumn wait between warmth and frost. Washington smelled faintly of paper and iron, and of things about to become official. Roosevelt's office was not grand that morning, only cluttered, maps of the Atlantic folded at the edges, the faint tick of the clock behind the desk. The president leaned back, cigarette holder balanced like punctuation between his fingers. Sachs began carefully. He spoke not of apocalypse but of energy, of industry, of the uses of understanding. He told the story of neutrons and lattices as if it were the natural continuation of steel and steam. He spoke of ships that might one day move without coal, of nations whose curiosity could turn into dominion if others hesitated. He never raised his voice. The president listened, tapping ash into a tray shaped like a compass rose. He asked questions that were practical, not philosophical. How long, how costly, how sure. When Sachs placed Einstein's letter before him, Roosevelt read it twice, the second time slower. Then he said, in the dry tone of a man who hides urgency behind calm, that the only thing to do was to make sure the Nazis didn't get it first. It sounded like prudence. It was the quiet ignition of an empire's engine. Within weeks, the letter had become a memorandum, the memorandum a committee, the committee a promise written between the lines of budgets. Men with clear minds and tired eyes began traveling by train between universities and military offices, speaking in acronyms that had not existed the season before. They met in borrowed classrooms and half-lit basements, whispering of cross-sections and purity levels, of isotopes that might change the arithmetic of destruction. None of it had a name yet. Names came later, after secrecy required disguises. Einstein knew only fragments of what followed. He read about new appropriations in the newspapers and understood too much from what was not said. In Princeton, he returned to his quiet rooms and the small blackboard filled with equations that no longer promised escape. He still gave guest lectures. He still received polite letters from admirers who imagined he lived in peace. But inside him there was a static that never quite settled. When he walked home in the evenings, the lamplight on the pavement reminded him of the glow he had tried to prevent. Szilárd, meanwhile, lived in a state between fatigue and disbelief. Each time he met a colonel or an administrator, he felt the translation of science into command. He wrote memoranda that multiplied like reflections in glass, each one sharper, each one less personal. He told himself that vigilance was a kind of morality, but he could feel the gravity of the thing growing beyond his reach. He dreamed often of the chain reaction, but now the dream was not abstract. In the dream, the flash arrived before the equation ended. By the winter of 1940, the first piles of graphite were stacked in silent rooms under stadiums and factories. The air smelled of metal filings and oil. Men in lab coats counted rods as if they were prayers. They spoke in low tones, not from secrecy alone but from reverence, the kind reserved for things that might disobey. Einstein declined several invitations to join advisory boards. He had no taste for bureaucracy and no wish to lend his name to every calculation. He told friends, half in jest, that he had become a political relic with equations attached. Yet he followed the news closely. When he read that Europe was burning and that ships carrying refugees were being turned away at American ports, he sat for a long time with his pipe unlit. The smoke that did not rise said enough. He kept Szilārd's letters in a neat stack, tied with a ribbon. Some were practical, others pleading. "We must keep pressure on them," Szilárd wrote. "Otherwise the effort will scatter." Einstein answered politely, sometimes with a single line, "Yes, but pressure has its own physics." By 1941, the machinery of secrecy had grown denser than any alloy. The scientists moved westward, to deserts where light had room to hide. Codenames appeared, and the words critical and threshold acquired a double meaning. The letter, which had once been a moral precaution, had become an instruction manual written by a ghost. In Princeton, Einstein aged in slow, visible increments. His hair, once comic in its defiance, began to seem more like insulation against the cold of what he knew. He walked to the institute each morning with the same deliberate pace, as if carrying a fragile equilibrium between guilt and necessity. Students still stopped him on the path, asking about relativity. He smiled kindly and gave simple answers. The complicated ones belonged to another century, and that century had already ended even as it continued. He still believed in reason, but reason now felt like a candle in a storm, brave, small, easily admired. The war was a noise in the distance that kept getting closer. At night, when he sat at his piano, he played slow movements by Mozart and imagined the sound traveling farther than radio waves, farther than orders, reaching someplace where understanding did not yet need to defend itself. Szilárd, for his part, could not rest. He feared that once the reaction began, political or atomic, it would not stop at containment. He tried to introduce clauses, committees of oversight, ethical advisories. Each was noted, filed, diluted. He saw how quickly a plan becomes doctrine, how easily urgency becomes ambition. When he walked home, he rehearsed conversations with Einstein that he never dared to start again. By 1942, the project had acquired a name he did not choose. Men he admired were now wearing security badges and answering to generals. The letter had succeeded. Success felt like a mispronounced prayer. Einstein read of these developments with the same restrained horror that one uses when reading an obituary for someone still breathing. He told a friend, "If I had known they would do this, perhaps I would have burned the paper." But he knew that even ash carries memory. When the first reports arrived of a controlled chain reaction under a stadium in Chicago, he sat silently for a long while. He pictured the faint blue glow, the hum of energy that no one could yet name without trembling. It was beautiful, and it was the end of a certain kind of innocence. After the war, when the newspapers finally caught up with what had been done in the desert, Einstein was asked to comment. He said, "My part was small." It was the truest and least comforting sentence he ever spoke. Reporters wanted regret. He offered clarity. "I do not regret the warning," he said. "I regret the world that required it." Szilárd, thinner now, lived with a constant fatigue that no sleep could erase. He tried to turn his energies toward controlling what had been unleashed. He helped found petitions, societies for atomic responsibility, organizations with names that sounded hopeful and haunted at once. At conferences, he spoke softly, insisting that the moral equation had not been solved, only multiplied. When he mentioned the letter, he always called it necessary, never good. Einstein spent his later years among books and students, his office full of dust motes drifting in light like the slow movement of time itself. He answered letters from strangers who wanted comfort and from statesmen who wanted endorsement. To the first he gave kindness, to the second silence. Occasionally, he would take the old ribbon of Szilārd's correspondence from a drawer and read a few lines. He never reread the letter to Roosevelt. He did not need to. It lived everywhere now. In the vocabulary of nations, in the invisible hum of the age. He took long walks by the lake near Princeton, the same path each day. Sometimes he would stop by the water's edge and watch the wind sculpt patterns on the surface. He thought of how fragile equilibrium really is, how every calm contains its own arithmetic of tension. He wondered if humanity could ever learn to hold knowledge without turning it into leverage. The answer did not arrive. The answers rarely do. One evening in late spring, he passed a group of children sailing toy boats near the bank. Their laughter carried across the water like something unbroken. He smiled and tipped his hat. The sight filled him with an ache that was almost joy. In his final years, he began writing a series of essays that he never published, meditations on responsibility, on the uses of understanding, on the strange comfort of accepting one's own powerlessness. In one, he wrote, "Every discovery is a mirror. The reflection is never of nature alone, but of the hands that hold it." Szilárd died before him, worn out from trying to persuade governments that vigilance was not paranoia. Einstein read the obituary quietly, then played a few notes on the piano, a slow, incomplete, but tender. The world went on, busier and louder. Laboratories multiplied, so did memorials. Nations drafted doctrines of deterrence and called them peace. And somewhere in an archive, the original letter still lay folded, its paper yellowing, its ink faint but legible. A curator once remarked that it was shorter than expected. Most hinges of history are. In another century, someone will stand before the glass case, read the opening line, and feel a small chill that has nothing to do with air conditioning. They will imagine the room on Long Island, the kettle, the quiet, the hesitation before the first word. They will think of how easily caution becomes prophecy and how even good men cannot always tell the difference. Outside that imagined room, the bay will still breathe. The light will still move across the floor. Somewhere, another mind will be dreaming of how to harness what flickers beyond understanding, convinced that this time, the knowledge will be gentler. And perhaps, on some future morning, another letter will begin.